Good evening. Thanks for being here. Appreciate your patience for the switch. I think it is a little better visible, more visible. I want to remind everyone that two events follow this one. One is a DJ set by Tana Vargas and Yasmin Guevara at Convenience West, where there will be barbecue as a menu that's sort of designed to be able to serve a lot of people, and I imagine there will be a lot of people. And then after that, there's a pride party at, my brain is cooked, Sentinel. The Sentinel, right? Yeah, cool. I am really excited to introduce my friend CJ Alvarez, who is the author of this book, Borderland, Border Water, A History of Construction on the U.S.-Mexico Divide, which played a big role in my thinking around a project that I was working on with Zoe Leonard, which is over there on the table. It's called All Rio to the River. This book was also important for Zoe. I just find CJ's like a really... This book is not the subject of today's talk, but it's certainly related. CJ's does this incredible job of... He can think like very broadly. He can approach the subject in a way that I feel is accessible, but without sacrificing its rigor. And in the midst, he develops a form of terminology. Like literally, he's like coining new words through which I think, at least for me, it really helped me to understand in importantly new ways this area where I live, or where many of us live. He has embarked a few years ago upon a kind of preposterously big subject, a history of the Chihuahuan Desert. And some of the questions that come up, I think, subsequent to proposing such a task to oneself are the subject of today's talk. And it's just in the nature of CJ's thinking and his curiosity and his sort of linguistic formulation. I'm excited for the talk. I'm excited for the book and everything that comes after that. And anyway, I really appreciate his coming all the way out here, and I hope you will join me in welcoming CJ Alvarez.
Oh, man. Hang on. Well, thanks, Tim. And thank you all for being here. You know, it's a very unusual, well, it's really a non-existent situation to be able to hand pick an audience you want. It doesn't really work that way. But if I could, that audience would include a lot of the people that are already sitting here in the audience today by default. And a lot of those people are far more expert in a lot of the topics I'm about to try to discuss than I am. And so this is a very honoring but also a very humbling situation to find myself in. So hopefully I can say something that you can use over the next few minutes. But just a really hearty thanks again to Tim for the invitation, and to Caitlin. This is... Tim's the best editor I ever had in this little piece that I contributed to the edited volume that Tim put together for the El Rio, and we had become these intellectual interlocutors over the course of 2 years, never had met, and then we met here, and then we went to the river, and we went out to the desert, and it just felt like it felt very natural and like a real homecoming. So this talk today, which is in the form of a question, I think indicates the rough draft nature of what I'm working with here. And this is a different kind of talk than a lot of the other talks that you might have seen so far in the festival. It's a mix between a description of the intellectual process that I've been fumbling through and hopefully finding my way through over the past few years. It has a couple of tips and tricks and observations for other people. I know there's a lot of people here interested in desert history and thinking about what that might mean. And then maybe, at least I feel, that it has some aspect of just philosophical or theoretical considerations about the meaning of deserts more generally, the meaning of history more generally. So that's the plan. Oh, there go the apricots. I first started thinking about the desert when I was a child, And I was growing up in the desert in southern New Mexico. And one of the reasons I chose this slide, which of course you're not going to be able to see anything over the course of the next hour, but just take my word for it. This is an up-close photograph I took not too long ago of the bottom of an arroyo back home in southern New Mexico. And this is iron sand. This is iron ore, iron filings that are in arroyo sand that we used to be fascinated with. When we were kids, we used to take magnets out there and attract these iron filings and play with them, and it seemed like a miraculous thing. And this was the one of many small examples of what I felt to be this intimacy and this very close relationship with the desert without really having any idea how to frame that or think about that or interpret that in a conceptual way. But when I look at this picture now, given the attempts I've made, at least over the years, to think in a more abstract way about the desert, I think about the questions of scale, and I think about the extent to which the way that water cuts in very small ways and very ephemeral ways in arroyos is not that different from the way it cuts an entire watershed. And I've been thinking a lot, and this is in large part, working with Tim and Zoe on this, with the El Rio project. And so I think there's also a really interesting to me, a resonance between this vertical downward looking approach at the landscape and then a lot of the satellite images that I'm going to show you in a little bit and how I'm thinking about those. Of course, none of these were questions I had in my mind as a child, and I left the desert for college and really have never lived there since. I go back all the time, and my family's still in the desert, but I haven't. I've lived longer outside the drylands than I have in the desert. And for many years, it never occurred to me that there was such a thing as desert history outside the context of naturalism or scientific analysis. I came back to it in the context of the border book that Tim just showed you. This map, which you probably can see because it's black and white, is the very typical political map of the U.S.-Mexico border, the map that delineates space and territory exclusively in political terms, in the political borders of states, in the political border, obviously, between the United States and Mexico, and in the border towns. And I find this to be simultaneously the most common map of the U.S.-Mexico border and the least helpful map. In fact, not just least helpful, but actually a damaging map insofar as it ignores almost everything about not just the non-human environment, but also the transportation infrastructure that very, very deeply connects the United States and Mexico and has only expanded in both border history and U.S.-Mexico relations history since the 1990s for reasons I don't have to explain here. So when I began writing the border book about construction, I became preoccupied with trying to think about ways to cartographically represent what I understood to be this very complex interplay between the non-human world, between the built environment, and between political developments broadly defined. And as I was editing the manuscript, I decided I should make a list of every single place name that I mentioned throughout the entire book. And I came with this long list, and I brought it to my map maker, this brilliant architecture student at UT. And I said, "Hey, Josh Conrad is his name. Yeah, do you think you could fit all this on a map and make it not look absolutely terrible?" And not only did it not make it terrible, he made it quite beautiful. This is, it's super small. Some of you have the book, you can look at it. But it's a map of the border region that, to me, at least in a strictly two-dimensional cartographic sense, represented in a much clearer way the the extent to which the border is not a place, but rather a series of places, each one of which has very specific attributes and very specific characteristics and very specific effects on people who live there and people who have lived there for a very long time in many cases. And as I'm writing the book about border builders, I became very interested in the way that the first surveyors from both the United States and Mexico encountered the desert. Because, of course, they're drawing these straight line borders, not on the river, but out on the western border. Very unusual in the mid-19th century to have borders that are just straight lines across the land. And these are surveyors that are coming from Mexico City. In other words, high altitude, high precipitation, just very different environment. They're coming from the eastern United States. And they all come out to survey this newly minted by treaty border, but not really by practice. And they hated it. They hated everything about it. They were perplexed by it, both the Mexicans and the Americans. The arid north had been a problem from the point of view of the central Mexican government for some time. What are we going to do about the low population density, about the indigenous populations? The Americans are just going to keep taking and taking. On the other side of the coin, you find the Americans asking themselves, why did we invade Mexico to take this land to begin with? And they're thinking in this they're using a very particular kind of environmental approach that is rooted almost exclusively in economic extraction. And so when they encounter landscapes and environments that don't have an obvious utility in that regard, they are immediately dismissed. So switching to the pure satellite image, there's a lot of people here who we can have a long debate about whether there is such a thing. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that this is something real, and this is a view of the land and the water of this section of North America. It is a truism in border studies and border history, and has been for some time, that the political border, as arbitrary as it is, especially the land border, doesn't acknowledge the trans-border dimensions of all kinds of aspects of the non-human world, of ecosystems, of animal migrations, and so on and so forth. And the reason this become a truism is because it's an important way for thinkers and scholars and writers and activists to point to the arbitrariness of the political divide. But in most cases, then the conversation comes back to the political divide and to the politics attached to that. So my objective became, and this is where the preposterousness comes in that Tim was talking about. I asked myself, what would it mean to write a history, to frame a history using environmental boundaries instead of political borders, and to take the ecoregion, the ecosystem, the natural region of a specific desert, not all the deserts of the border, but a specific desert, and ask the question: is there such a thing as a history that can be bounded that way in a useful way? Not to ignore the political developments that would come later, but to take that border studies truism the next mile and see how it works in practice. The first thing I did when I decided that this was the provocation of the project was to think about desert history in terms of style, in terms of how other people, mainly historians, had written about deserts in the past, and to what extent there was a body of work in environmental history that dealt squarely with drylands. And what I encountered, and I'm generalizing here to a certain extent, but what I encountered were two major narrative types. The first and most common, I would say, is the wasteland narrative. And this is the narrative that I encountered with the border builders when they come and they're like, where the hell are we? This is a nightmare. And why are people living here? If people are living here, that must mean that those people are beneath us in one way or another. And the wasteland narrative is specific, especially to the 19th century, goes back to the 18th century, 17th century, really back. I think you could make an argument before European contact and the Aztec concept or the Mexica concept of the Gran Chichimeca. We can talk about that if you want in the Q&A in more detail. But the point that I want to make about the wasteland narrative is that it is specifically rooted in this kind of economic thinking, like I mentioned a few minutes ago. And so what you find is that wasteland, in our understanding of the term, is just an epithet and a dismissive, derogatory term, but it actually has a pretty specific meaning in contrast to timberland and cropland and grazing land. And so it is literally, from an economic point of view, a wasteland in this form of writing. And this writing is coming from like chronicles themselves, and it's also coming from the way that historians, environmental historians, have chosen to write about deserts. And then, and this is a very, very 20th century phenomenon, you have the romantic narrative of desert history. And I think it is safe to say that a lot of what we're all doing here in Marfa and a lot of what we like about Marfa is in one way or another derived from that intellectual genealogy and that narrative genealogy about the romantic desert, or as Raquel was citing Rubén Martínez, he calls it the boutique desert, right, in his book, in contrast, of course, to the desert of addiction. The romantic narrative of the desert is made possible through masking technology. And that's as simple as air conditioners and groundwater pumping and ways to live in the desert without directly confronting desert conditions. And it is a narrative that intentionally decouples the history of the desert from economic exploitation. In fact, it's the exact opposite of that. It's the desert as aesthetic object and aesthetic backdrop and place for contemplation, which is mostly a 20th century phenomenon in like a narrative sense, but you know, if you really want to get into it, there's a biblical sense that goes way, way back about the desert as refuge and as some version of that. I wouldn't call it romantic. You encounter, you know, serpents and Satan and that kind of thing out there. So it's not exactly Edward Abbey and Georgia O'Keeffe and Donald Judd, but what I came to think as I noticed these narratives showing up over and over and over again, the wasteland narrative and the romantic narrative, is that they're in fact two sides of the exact same coin. They are perspectives on the desert conceived by outsiders. They are conceived in the context of the encounter, whether it's whether it's a colonial encounter, whether it's an economic sort of a topographic survey in the anticipation of economic exploitation or extractivism, or whether it is the encounter of the romantic desert by people who find desert conditions exotic in one way or another because they come from different environments and they're not used to all the things that, again, I don't have to explain to this audience. I think you know exactly what I mean. Oh yeah. In this context, it's important to recognize, and I'm a historian, a lap start historian, but a historian. So I work mainly with archives. And outsiders' perspectives, not just on the desert, but on any environment, are very easy historical sources to work with because they're they're engineered already in the context of a narrative. They're using language that is kind of built to be accessible to other outsiders. And so it's very tempting to attach yourself to outsiders' environmental narratives, and then let that run your own story and let that shape your own narrative. And this is something that is very, very common in environmental history. In contrast to all of this, I became then very interested in desert dwellers' perspectives. And the first problem you get there is, what is a desert dweller? Like, who counts as a desert dweller? And then we can have a long debate about that. But I have a very simple definition, working definition for this, and it is simply someone who, in their daily life and livelihood, confronts desert conditions, specifically heat and aridity, for their entire lives. In other words, people who know no other environment. And where I think this becomes tricky, and why I want to be very precise about this, is I don't think that being a desert dweller necessarily implies an ethnic or racial category. I think it is better understood as a technological category, because for many centuries, even settler populations and even colonial populations who purported to control territory, although they often didn't, had no significantly different respite from desert conditions than native populations in those places, or later from mestizo populations in those places. From a source perspective, desert dwellers' perspectives are much more difficult to work with, for the reason that desert dwellers typically, and I'm talking about in the historical record, don't use the word desert. And so you have to think in more roundabout ways of how you might identify desert people in the archival record. Desert people, more often than not, exhibit environmental awareness and environmental knowledge through very specific contexts, specific valleys, specific river basins, specific arroyos. And so so the question of like very local place names becomes paramount. There's no reason for most desert people throughout history to ever think ecosystemically and to think in the context that we would map out the contemporary Chihuahuan Desert, which I'll talk about also in a second. And on a personal note, part of what this realization led me to confront is the fact that I might not be a desert dweller after all, and that it is possible, in fact, probable, and in most cases likely, that since the mid-20th century, since the development of these masking technologies, it is possible to be born in the desert and not be a desert dweller, to be born in the desert and not have a meaningful sense of place in great depth, in terms of place names, in terms of plant names, in terms of plant uses, and the list goes on and on. And so this creates an interesting timeline question, which I guess we'll return to in a little bit. So then this leads me to another question, and that is, what are we talking about? Where do we get this term Chihuahuan Desert to begin with? A very common aspect of desert writing just kind of takes those categories completely for granted, as if these are self-evident things like the United States and Mexico that don't need to be explained, and we all just accept, oh, that's the Sonoran Desert, and that's the Mojave Desert, and that's the Great Basin, and this is the Chihuahuan Desert, and this struck me as a bigger and bigger problem, because the more I tried to read about this, I couldn't actually make any headway into what why we all felt that we were on the same page in terms of ecoregion speak. And so the way we think about the Chihuahuan Desert, the way we define the borders of the Chihuahuan Desert today, I think, are the result of about 120 years of very contentious debate and back and forth about, specifically in the realm of geography, although in other realms as well, as we'll talk about, spearheaded initially almost entirely by the British, the French, and the Germans, and then their students in the United States and Mexico. And the Mexican geographers and the American geographers in the early 20th century they're all reading in French and German and English, thinking or trying to think about American, broadly defined, like environments in the Americas in a regionalist way, the way that European geographers were trying to do. And it all centered around one question, and that is how and under what circumstances and how specific should we or could we get in delineating environmental boundaries. And this involves a whole host of very complex questions, and in the early 20th century, harder to measure questions, given the history of technology associated with that. Do you delineate environmental boundaries according to climate, precipitation, water budgets, plant life, which plant life, animal life? Animals move, some of them don't. Birds, it's a nightmare. It doesn't really help, except in the context of some species, and on and on and on. Soil composition, and then the question that some people will recognize immediately: riparian zones. Do they count? Do they not? The Sky Islands, and on and on and on. And so this is the substance of these debates in geography for decades and decades. And so what you can see here, I mean, the question is, that's another satellite image there on the left. You can't really make it out, but the question is like what to do with this space, what to do with this territory. And what you're looking at here on the left is an excerpt from a paper that was published by David Morafka. Some people might know he was a herpetologist working in the 70s and 80s, and he, which is reptiles and amphibians, by the way. Sometimes it's a misleading term. And this is his representation of minimalist and maximalist boundaries of the Chihuahuan Desert. He wrote this series of articles in the 1980s basically questioning the very premise that we could or should delineate natural boundaries to begin with. And so what you're seeing in the minimalist map of the Chihuahuan Desert is this Swiss cheese model. And you all recognize this as like the Sky Islands. And you will also recognize, if you can see, if you can make it out, that the Marfa Plain isn't in the Chihuahuan Desert. And Tim's over there laughing because he and I have been going around about this for a while now. But I've been here for the past month, just in this like self-appointed residency, trying to work on this book, and I've been wandering around and talking to people and driving around, and I said to Tim last week, I'm like, this is the least Chihuahuan Desert part of the Chihuahuan Desert I've ever been to, and yet that's the sort of the bill of goods that keeps the romantic narrative of Marfa alive and very well. So I won't take it away. Well, here's the maximalist map for you. So guess what? Here's the larger version of what the Chihuahuan Desert looks like, and it definitely encompasses not only the grasslands here, but it encompasses the Sky Islands, which of course, like the archaeologists pointed out yesterday, are totally different environments in all of the senses that I just laid out: climate, elevation, plant life, animal life, so on and so forth. So these two maps are the EPA ecoregion maps that are the definitive boundary lines that we use today, and that are the result of even more intense debates with not just geographers, but dozens of different government agencies and other land management organizations in the United States, in Mexico, and Canada over the course of the last 20, 30 years. And so what you're looking at on the left is the large bore delineation of environmental regions. So all that yellow there, the 10.0, are just deserts, and you can see there's warm deserts, cold deserts. It's just and that's decided more or less on precipitation. Now what you see here on the more zoomed in scale is a different level of differentiation between different deserts, different sort of montane zones that divide them, and I think I'm sure that there are people in the audience right now looking at these maps saying, I don't think that's the exact border of the Chihuahuan. I don't think that's where the Stockton Plateau really ends. Welcome to the club. That's basically the kind of conversation that's been going on for 120 years, of just kind of picking back and forth about what counts, what doesn't, and how we might do this. And of course, the people who drafted these maps all understood full well that the lines, the use of line to make maps like this is fundamentally an abstraction, because we're talking about fields. We're talking about transition zones. And this is one of the many important differences and much more interesting ways to think about borders than political borders, where with the U.S.-Mexico border is one example, a quintessential example, the obsession with precision. Where exactly is the border? And once we figure out where exactly the border is, then all the implications that flow from that in terms of rights and citizenship and who's who and who counts for what flow from that cartographic precision. So it's not, we're looking at an intentional abstraction here. So once I started asking questions about this intellectual history of environmental regions mapping, I realized that I had blown completely past the archives in a way that I was familiar with and trained as a historian. And in this context, realized that you could write distinct histories of just the weather stations, just the river gauges, just the land surveys, just privatization, just human impact, agriculture, cattle grazing, and all the different permutations of land use and land transformation in both countries and in at least 5 states, and it becomes very, very complicated. And all of this research that I tried to dip my toe into is written in very specialized language. And some of those people speak those languages here in the audience, the language of archaeology and of the natural sciences. And so in this context, I realized that the question of style that I had originally been preoccupied with, style and narrative, was actually even more complicated than I thought, because the history of the desert ends up also in the realm of vocabulary. And all these different, I wouldn't even say competing, these kind of almost siloed and atomized sets of vocabulary that different disciplines use to describe the exact same place. So this presents a very interesting opportunity, for me at least, to think about how to merge the discipline of history with the natural sciences and with archaeology. One way I do that is I just hang out with Brian and Eric out in the field, and with other people who just kind of let me watch what they do and let me ask questions like I'm a college freshman at best. But this is very interesting from a historiographical point of view, also because the natural sciences and history didn't used to be so siloed and split. In fact, in the 19th century, it was quite normal to think about history as both a set of human endeavors and also an engagement with the natural world. And so the extent to which historians, a wide range of natural scientists and even engineers, are all asking separate questions in different languages about the same place is another 20th century phenomenon that has to do with the history of higher education and how that evolved in the United States and in Mexico, which we can talk about also. Oh, whoops. Here's the super detailed. This is what they call the level 4. So now we're looking at the Big Bend, and you can see, you can't make out the details. You can look this all up online, but you can see that you can just keep doing this, going in finer and finer resolution and distinguishing in finer and finer ways the differences between the differences that you all recognize intuitively and recognize visually from just driving around. And there are words and there are maps attached to this, for better or for worse. So the final question, so now we're back to just like the massive satellite map, no political borders at all, and no ecological region mapping. The final question, this is what I've been grappling with for a while, and this is a real mess, is so if these are something that approximates the real boundaries of the desert, and let's just say for the sake of argument that they are, well, how long have they been there? And the archaeologists are, feeling a certain way right now, and you saw what happened when I asked the question about people yesterday, and it starts to get pretty difficult to reconstruct anything. So I decided that if I were to write a desert history, that I would have to adopt the desert's timescale. And this, again, for people who really want to get into the weeds about this, I think that especially in recent years, and by recent years I mean past like 40 or 50 years, a lot of academic, professional history writing has gotten much narrower and narrower in terms of the timescale scope, such that in some cases the time it takes to actually write a monograph in history is longer than the time scale that it is about, right? So very, very, very specific kinds of histories where the challenge is not to demonstrate change over time, but the challenge is to demonstrate something very, very nuanced and precise. But the implicit assumption that is embedded in that I think some folks are not fully aware of, is that we're inadvertently working in the context of a human life, and in the context of the kind of time frame and scale that we can comprehend as human beings who've witnessed other human beings be born, live, and die, and then approach the world from that vantage point. Or what we do implicitly is use the parameters handed to us by nation states and adopt the default political histories of individual states, formerly territories, formerly here's the Spanish maps, and on and on and on. And so again, we fall into the trap of that kind of historical political thinking. That's not just enmeshed in borders; it's also meshed in time scale and time frame, periodization. So another way to contextualize environmental history and this question of scale that I've been dealing with is to point out that a lot of what environmental history writing ends up looking like is a history of what people have done to some part of nature, or conversely, what some part of nature has done to us, such as viruses and among many other things. And so, again, I don't have to explain in the context of this audience the history of overgrazing, the history of dam building, the history of river management, and so on and so forth. And I would argue, and I think that a deeper desert history argues, that while very important, that is a way of approaching environmental history from an anthropocentric point of view. And when you push your sense of time outside of the context of a human life, then you are forced to engage with a philosophical tradition known as ecocentrism, which is simply to say that we might not be the most interesting things to ever happen in the desert, and the havoc that we've wreaked in the desert might not be the most important transformation in this environment, and that the non-human world, not just the non-human biological world, but even the abiotic world, might have a will of its own. That there might be a way to think about the non-human world as self-willed. And I find this both very disorienting and very intimidating, and also a huge relief and quite exhilarating, because I think that one of the loads that I've certainly been carrying, and I know a lot of other people in this room, this open air shed have been carrying, is the extent to which we have been forced into speaking and talking and writing in a very difficult political context with respect to the border and with respect to the non-human world. And so for me to take myself into a deeper past, to think not exclusively in terms of human scale, has been quite liberating. But the same set of problems that come with environmental regions mapping that I laid out briefly before also are attached to deep time or big history, except they're complicated by a multi-millennial time scale. So, and here's where I would defer to the experts in the room, but let's say that if the question is, how long has the desert been here? Let's say that it's been here for 9,000 years. And why? Why would we say that? Well, something that kind of looks like the assemblages of plants that we are seeing today started to emerge, give or take 1,000 or 2 years, depending on where you are and what today we call the Chihuahuan Desert, in that time period. In other words, the Ice Age ended. The climate became more dry. The rain became less frequent. The gap in temperature between the winter and the summer expanded. And a whole set of plants that were equipped to live in the Ice Age left. There's a very interesting way that scientists write about plant communities as if they're, they call them migrants, right? That they, the plant communities migrated up to higher elevations, they retreated, and then different plants came in. Of course, individual plants don't move, right? Or at least not in that sense. So we're talking at a species level, we're talking at a multi-millennial level. But I think the metaphor is apt. And so Once you start to understand this, you realize that the configuration of plants that we're using as a proxy for place that we call the Chihuahuan Desert is and has always been a moving target. Even if you factor in the very heavy human use in the past 200 years. So in this context, we get into ancient pollen analysis and pack rat midden analysis, and all in the context of carbon-14. And I could talk at great length about pack rats. I've come to see the pack rat, which is this animal that lives for 3 years, but gives us insight into the past 40,000 years, as one of the most productive and in some ways gentle interspecies histories and animal histories that we have. When we think of animal histories, we think of breaking horses and raising cattle and domesticating canines and so on and so forth. But pack rats is very, very light touch. The way that we have interacted with those animals, with this nuclear age technology of radiocarbon dating, through which we can reconstruct all these configurations of plants. Oh my God. We, some people talk about this as deep time. Some people talk about it as big history. I mean, deep time, again, here we get into this relativistic thing where the geologists are like, well, no, deep time is like billions of years. I mean, this is nothing. We're talking about the Holocene, another specialized term. We're talking about just millennia. And we're trying to figure out, well, what are the species that might be left over from the last ice age, the junipers, some of the oaks, the populations of plants, in other words, that live in the Sky Islands. Humans, of course, are also left over from the Pleistocene, are also left over from the Ice Age. And this is what I found so fascinating as I've listened to these other talks. And as I've learned so much from the Center for Big Bend Studies over at Cell Ross about this way of trying to think in the most expansive way possible and trying to merge in the most expansive way possible human history, natural history, geological history, in a way that is not just the purview of science in impenetrable ways, just the purview of anthropology, but something that attempts to make some kind of narrative, and in so doing, I hope, renders the political paradigm that we find ourselves locked inside of through infrastructure, through the built environment, and through institutions, makes that look a bit odder, as odd as it, I think, should look in the context of this deep time and this big history. But I don't think deep time is a great word for it. I think it's unfathomable. I think it is unfathomable time. And I think it is an unfathomable experience to not just try to learn how to read a landscape for change over time, but to read a landscape as actually multiple timelines in terms of species and in terms of formations, all operating at the same moment. And so the question is, what is desert history? This is what I would say. I would give you two provisional answers to that question. I think one, desert history is as much an intellectual history as it is an environmental history. I don't think it's possible to fully reckon with the language and the narrative and the categories that we use for environments without reckoning with the history of ideas that produced that language to begin with. And so in this sense, deserts exist only in our minds, and yet they are still more out there than say the United States of America is, or Mexico is, as completely artificial categories and ways of bounding space. And I think the history of technology is a big part of this. I think that to tell desert history, at least the way I want to tell it, is tantamount to engaging with a history of technology as well. And then the second provisional answer I would offer is to think ecocentrically more than anthropocentrically, and that is not to exclude humans. Obviously, like I said, we've seen so many fascinating ways of engaging with the human history in the desert in a much longer time scale. But to begin from the point to begin on the time scale of the desert itself, and then categorize the other timelines of those of us who've occupied this space accordingly. And I would say to consider the non-human world as self-willed, and I'm quoting here from Roderick Nash, this classic book, Wilderness in the American Mind, from the 1960s, where he talks about this notion, at least maybe in like the most recent epilogue. Anyway, but I find that idea very compelling, and I find that idea very very satisfying, not as a way of escaping the context of the desert today, both environmentally and politically, not in the way of escaping human history, but rather incorporating it into a very different frame. So I'll stop there, and I guess we can have questions. I'm very, very eager to hear what you all have to say. So what do you have to say?